Today I want to talk to you a little bit about Julie Otsuka's novel, When the Emperor Was Divine. And in order to frame it effectively, I'm going to highlight some of the themes and stylistic impulses that you'll see in this novel and provide some context, some historical context by highlighting some key information about the relocation of Japanese Americans that happened during World War II. So let's start with that information about these internment camps that were created in 1942 as a result of President Roosevelt's Executive Order number 9066. As you remember, during World War II, the United States was engaged in combat not just with the Third Reich in Germany, but also with Japan. And the president and his administration believed that if Japan could attack Pearl Harbor, they could just as easily attack the west coast of the United States. And motivated by fear and a lot of ignorance, but mostly fear, President Roosevelt was motivated to declare the entire western seaboard as military space. And that allowed him and other leaders in his administration to determine that for their own safety, all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast needed to be relocated inland. So on March 29th, 1942, a forced evacuation began. Notices were posted publicly telling Japanese Americans that they had 48 hours to gather a few of their belongings and report to train stations where they would be loaded onto train cars and then moved to internment camps in places like Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Arkansas, Idaho, and on the far northern edge of California. As you can see in some of the pictures that I have on the screen, these internment camps were basically a series of military type compounds, these bunkers where people would stay. Multiple families would be in a single unit. The space that they occupied was very small, so you'd have an entire family living in something equivalent to the space of maybe one or two of the dorm rooms on our campus. They had these compounds, these internment camps or relocation centers, as they were euphemistically identified by the American government, were surrounded by razor wire and armed military guards. The rationale was that these citizens were being protected from outsiders. However, there were stiff penalties, including death, if anyone inside those relocation centers tried to leave. As one a man who survived these internment camps asked, if the camps were for our protection, why were the guns held by those guards always pointed inward, not outward? Families had to leave behind almost everything they owned. Many of these Japanese Americans, I think I read that 80% of the people who were relocated were American citizens. They were maybe second, third generation immigrants, but they were legal citizens of the United States, but they were forcibly relocated. They had to leave their homes, most of their belongings, their property, their jobs, their businesses behind. And they remained inside these camps for 3 years or more. At the conclusion of World War II, these men, women, and children were released, but unfortunately, when they tried to return home, they faced terrible discrimination and racism in their communities. Often their homes had been seized and vandalized or simply stolen out from under them. All of the belongings that they had left behind in their homes were stolen. Their businesses had been ransacked. Their automobiles had been taken. So they had very little left when they returned to their lives and had to rebuild from scratch. 112,000 persons were forcibly relocated during this time period. In 1988, I believe it was, President Reagan officially issued an apology to these men, women, and children who experienced this terrible internment and acknowledged the unconstitutionality and injustice of that. He also issued an order that $20,000 be paid as a kind of restitution to each person who suffered that long internment. But this is a stain on our history. And unfortunately, very few people in the United States know much about this action that the government took and that the American public endorsed and supported. I hope that some of you learned about this part of our history when you studied World War II, either in your high school classes or in some of the college classes you may have had here at AU. If not, then this is something you really do need to research and understand. Otsuka's novel gives us one picture, a kind of glimpse into this experience. She depicts one family's experience. It is a fictional story, but it is based on a very real, the reality of thousands of men, women, and children in the early 1940s. Okay, the other topic that I want to point your attention to today is the themes and stylistic impulses that are often common to Asian American literature but are demonstrated very clearly in Otsuka's novel. So she does focus, I think, quite a bit on the issue of privacy in the lives of the men and women in her story. You know, that when the story begins, they are a prosperous upper middle class family living in Berkeley, California. They own their own home. They are respected and engaged in their community. And that all changes when they are forcibly removed from their home to a camp, I believe in Utah. So their desire for privacy and dignity is severely challenged when they are forced into this camp where there's very little boundary between their living space and other people's living space, where their letters to and from the husband and father in the story are censored. So this value of privacy, this desire to protect intimacies is really violated in this story, and we see that real clearly in the novel. Integrity and honor, of course, are themes in much of the literature we've been reading. In Asian culture, having a responsibility to one's culture is often an expectation, and ties to extended family or the larger village is highly valued. So knowing this helps us understand why it is so significant and why it would have been such a sacrificial, painful act for the mother in this story to destroy those items that she and her husband had carried with them from their homeland. You know, she burns clothing and photographs and things that connected her to her family. Personal honor is often viewed as the highest value, and the father's honor, his personal honor and integrity, is challenged and completely denied in this story, and that contributes to the devastation that he experiences. It helps us to understand why he is nearly annihilated by the experience of being arrested and held for years and accused of treason. Some of the stereotypes that people in American culture, particularly Caucasians, non-Asian Asians in American culture have imposed on people of Asian ancestry include assumptions, beliefs that they are the enemy, that anyone of Asian descent is a communist, that people of Asian descent are emotionless and cold, cruel, that women are demure and always submissive. Also the assumption that Asians are intellectually acute and very serious, but of course there's also the negative stereotype believes that this intelligence is used for evil purposes. All of these beliefs are lies, and we can see very clearly the consequences of having those stereotypes, those false beliefs adopted by the majority of people in a culture and used against a minority group in that culture. Those lies and false beliefs are what drove the leadership in American culture in the U.S. government and military, and then American citizens in the places where Asian Americans lived to imprison thousands and thousands of people simply because of their ethnic identity. You will see in this novel, much like you saw in Lee's poetry, a spareness, a minimalist approach to artistry. There is color in this novel, but it is used sparingly. And as the family suffers their long imprisonment, color is stripped away. The elements of nature that are beautiful are stripped away from the novel. And black and white and shades of gray replace the lush richness of life that they experienced in California. You'll also recognize Otsuka's use of juxtaposition and understatement. She expresses very clearly the impact that this experience had on the different members of the family, but she does that through implication and by juxtaposing images side by side or characters' actions, describing them very clearly and allowing the reader to interpret those actions or those images to understand what's happening inside these characters, both within their personal identity and within their relationships with one another, their relationships with people in the larger community, their relationship with the larger nation. Otsuka also pays attention to disparities and contradictions between what's happening in the outside world and what's happening on the interior world of the characters. And she gives voice to all four characters' points of view. We open with the experience of the forced relocation, and we're guided through those moments through the mother's perspective. Then Otsuka shifts to first the daughter's point of view and then the son's point of view. The fourth chapter is a collective we, first person point of view, but the voice is representing the experience and perceptions of the mother, daughter, and son, all three of them when they return to their home in Berkeley. And then of course the final chapter is from the perspective of the father, the exiled father who returns home, just a shell of himself. I hope that you pay close attention to this novel. It's a slim novel, so you can take your time reading it. Read it carefully. Don't rush. Have patience. Appreciate the silences in this book. It's a heart-wrenching story, but I think it's one of the most beautiful novels I've ever encountered, and I hope that you will find it both meaningful and inspiring.